Hey guys, this is Mike, letusreason.com. This is going to be an incredible episode today. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. I have a great guest on with me today, Henry Smith from Associates for Biblical Research. And I'm going to let him do a full introduction of himself when I hand this over to him because he has a very detailed presentation that he's going to share with us today. But he did a lot of the scholarly work comparing the genealogies and the ages of the patriarchs in the Septuagint, which, as most of you probably know, is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament around 250 BC. And that was the Bible that was used by Jesus in the early church, versus the numbers that have come down to us in our English Old Testaments today, which come from the rabbinic tradition called the Masoretic text. And the point really here comes down to the fact that the numbers are different in each, which begs the question, which one is correct? Well, that's Henry's specialty, and he's going to talk about it today from a scholarly standpoint. And that's what I really want everyone in the audience to understand. This man is a legitimate scholar, and I'm going to put all of his links to his published papers, all the research that he's done on this in a pinned comment, so you guys can all find that pretty easily. And then in addition to that, his other regular social links are going to be in the video description below. But guys, before I bring Henry on, I want to set the table a little bit and just explain one reason why all of this matters within the Bible prophecy world. And I've had many recent comments on this on some of my other videos. So I'm glad that Henry's here today to address this subject, and I think put it to bed for good from a scholarly evidentiary standpoint. Now, none of what I'm about to say had anything to do with what motivated him to look into this subject. So I just want to point that out. But I bring this up because on my channel, as most of you know, one of my major themes is Bible prophecy and trying to correct some of the unfortunate poor Bible interpretation and the silly sort of rapture prediction nonsense that's all over the internet. And one such theory is what some have called the 7,000-year week, where the assumption is that human history from Adam until the end of the future millennium is going to have a total of 7,000 years. And from this, these folks extrapolate another theory called the rapture window. And it goes kind of like this, that so you start with the 7,000 years, and then you subtract 1,000 because we know that there's a future millennial kingdom. And of course, you're left with 6,000. Well, the thought is that we're approaching the 6,000 year mark. That's what they claim. That since Jesus died in 33 AD, then, because we're approaching 2033, then it's going to be 2,000 years since Christ. And the idea is that's going to be the 6,000th year. And since we know that there's a 7-year tribulation also, then they subtract 7 from 2033, which brings us to 2026. Well, if you believe in a pre-tribulation rapture, like I do, and like the people who unfortunately propose this do, then you're left with a so-called rapture window, as they call it, between right now and 2026, where the rapture can occur. Now, of course, you guys are all probably tired of hearing me talk about the real biblical teaching, the true biblical teaching on this issue, which is imminence. The fact that the rapture is completely sudden, signless, and unpredictable. And that the word imminence itself also means that there's no minimum amount of time that's needed for the imminent event to take place, to transpire. It's an any moment possibility all throughout the church age. And the first century apostles themselves, Paul and the others, all expected it as possible during their lifetimes, meaning that they had no concept that the church age or the inter-advent age had to extend to the 2,000-year point before it could happen, or that it had to get close to that before it could happen. They had no idea about that. But even beyond all of that, there's a very easy way to debunk all of this 7,000 years for human history and all this rapture window stuff. And that's what we're going to talk about today. That's the fact that right now in 2025, we are already way past not only the 6,000 year mark, but it's actually been about 7,500 years already right now since Adam. And that's what we're going to talk about today. That's what we're told in the Septuagint, which contradicts the almost 6,000 years that people see in our modern English Old Testaments, which come from, again, the Masoretic tradition. And so, what it comes down to is my guest today, Henry, is going to go through the evidence today that demonstrates that this popular teaching I just explained to you, that so many people have heard about on popular Rapture entertainment channels, as I like to call them, is absolutely wrong. And I'm sure that what we're going to look at today has never been mentioned on any of those channels. I wonder why not. Well, I guess that's because they're not willing to let the actual evidence get in the way of putting out popular sensationalistic videos that get them paid and get them clicks and get them views. Well, we're not about that on this channel. We have to stick to the biblical truth and the evidence. And so I say all of that just to lay the foundation for what Henry is going to present today. So I'm sorry for the long introduction, but I think it's going to make today's video even more relevant to you within the realm of what often masquerades as Bible prophecy. So with that, Henry, welcome. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be on your program. Thank you for your kind words and the first part of your introduction. I really appreciate it. I'm glad to be here. Glad to talk about the subject.
All right. Well, I'm just going to just hand this over to you and let you run with it and just let you take us through your presentation. I know you have a lot of details included,
Sure.
so feel free to take all the time you need. We're in no rush at all today. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and bring up your presentation and take it away.
Excellent. Well, thanks again, Mike, for your great introduction. Even though this subject we're going to talk about does have a scholarly depth to it, I'm going to do everything I can to explain it in a way that hopefully is understandable, and not scare off certain members of your audience. We want them to stay, so please don't be intimidated by that. We're going to dive into some stuff a little bit deep, but hopefully in a way that you'll be able to process and reflect on what we're talking about. So Mike asked me to do just a little bit of a quick introduction about myself and the ministry I work for. For 20 years, I've been with the Associates for Biblical Research. We're a ministry located in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. We mainly do archaeology. We've had 3 excavations in Israel, and presently we actually excavated biblical Shiloh, a very important site. For those of you out there who ever wanted to go on an archaeological dig, we have volunteers go every year. So check out our website, digshiloh.org, if you want to volunteer. No experience required. So just a willing heart and the doctor's okay is all that's needed to join us. Just let me tell you a little bit about the ministry of ABR. My main role at ABR is I do research, which we're going to talk about today. I'm also the administrative director of the Shiloh excavations. Administrative means I take care of logistics. I am not the archaeological director. That's a different gentleman named Scott Stripling. But that's my job, to administrate the dig, take care of a bunch of different things, hotel arrangements, and all that kind of stuff. But ABR was founded in 1969 by a gentleman named David Livingston. And fundamentally, the ministry began because of his encounter with archaeologists who were saying that the Bible was wrong about the account in the book of Joshua about the city of Ai. The archaeological evidence, where the city was located, was it consistent with the biblical text? And since then, the ministry has grown well beyond that initial initiative to include the kind of work that I'm doing, which is what we're gonna talk about. One more little plug before we dive into our stuff. I'm also the host of a TV program called Digging for Truth. And if you want to know more about our show, you can just go to our YouTube page. You can scan that QR code there and you can be off to the races. We have over 260 TV shows that are up online, all kinds of biblical subjects, basically upholding the reliability of Scripture. So it's a free resource for those of you who might be interested in archaeology. You can sort of bookmark that for after the show and check that out if you would like to do that. But on to the topic at hand, right, Mike? That's what we want to get to. We want to talk about the genealogies of Genesis 5 and 11. And I've been working on this project for a number of years, and we are gonna get to the most important part of this that Mike related, and that is the numbers in Genesis 5 and 11. I'm going to show you some evidence related to that. But I do want to tell you, just there's three major aspects of this research. The first is, well, you can check out. I apologize. You can check out the research at our website, and Mike's going to include that information. But one of the things that we wanted to do with this project is establish the proper doctrinal and hermeneutical foundation for interpreting the numbers. Not surprisingly, the secular world doesn't believe that these were actual ages that these patriarchs lived to. And actually, that's a growing movement within evangelicalism as well, that these numbers are symbolic, that the lifespans are not literal lifespans, and so forth and so on. We believe they are. And that's tied directly to the calculation of human history that Mike alluded to at the very beginning. So we've done research on that, and really reestablishing the chronological interpretation as the actual, that this is what the text yields when you interpret it very carefully and very correctly, that you actually do have a time frame from Adam to the flood and from the flood to Abraham. That is calculable, and you can get a pretty close approximation to the amount of time that elapsed. That view was held in the church for over 18 centuries and in the Judaism that preceded it. But as a result of Darwinism in the 19th century and the Enlightenment worldview, it was supplanted. And now it is the minority view, but I do believe it is actually the correct view of the biblical text.
So, in other words, the idea that it's when the Bible says that somebody begets somebody else, it's one person to the next, an
Correct.
unbroken chain, and there's no invisible, silent gaps where there's all these additional people in between that would expand or kind of inflate the timelines. Is that
Yeah.
what you're saying?
Yeah, that's right. And even this, Mike, the way the syntax is structured on several of the relationships we know for certain are father-son relationships. Adam and Seth, for example, and Enosh is a direct son of Seth. And on the other side, we have Lamech and Noah, right? And across the flood, Shem, and then into the early period. But let's say you have two patriarchs back to back, Jared and Enoch, okay? Even if there were names missing in between, the way the syntax is structured, it doesn't matter. There's not missing time. And so even if one were be able to say that there was a genealogical gap, because we don't know from other passages if Enoch is certainly the direct son of Jared, the way the syntax is structured, it doesn't matter. Enoch is born when Jared is 162 years old. Whether he's his son, his grandson, or his great-grandson, it doesn't matter. So in defending the chronological interpretation, we can show there are no chronological gaps. Even if there might be, and I'm not sure if there is, I don't think there are genealogical gaps, but even if there were, the syntax is structured in such a way that it doesn't matter. So you still have a chronological continuum from Adam to the flood and from the flood to Abraham. So that's a very interesting result of our research. In other words, we don't have to defend every name is there, even though I think that's probably the case. The syntax definitively eliminates chronological gaps. So we can calculate the time period when the flood happened and approximately when Adam was created. It's a great question and a great point. It's one of the results of our research. And so along those lines, our approach is to study the biblical text thoroughly and exegete it carefully in its canonical context. And then anything outside the Bible that we might use, archaeology or the history of interpretation, linguistic studies, ancient Near Eastern history, all that is subservient to the biblical text. It has the text has authoritative priority over those external truth claims. And often methodologically today in evangelicalism, that is not usually how Genesis is interpreted, particularly these early chapters. The external claims tend to lord over the text, and then the text ends up getting reinterpreted in ways that really stretch it beyond what it actually means. So it's really important to understand what method we want to employ when we're actually studying the Bible. That God has spoken in a way that's clear, And now, not everything is equally clear. Some things are immediately clear, and some things we discover are clear when we do some work. But the Word of God is not obscured in such a way that only experts in the 21st century can really understand what it means. And that's really important for us to understand that God's people have been able to open up His Word and understand it for all these millennia. So that's our approach. We have a high view of the text, and the text has priority over the external. And I did 3 episodes of Digging for Truth where I discussed this in detail. My colleague interviews me. So anyone who's interested in these aspects of our method and how we approach this whole subject, you can check out that 3-part series on chronology in the Bible and why the text should be interpreted that way and the method that we employ. But now let's get to the good stuff, right, Mike? I mean, we had to lay a little bit of a foundation, but we want to get to the point, the most important point that we're focusing on here today, and that is we have 3 main traditions that preserve the numbers in Genesis 5 and 11, and they differ from one another. We have the Hebrew Masoretic text, we have the Greek Septuagint, and we have what's called the Samaritan Pentateuch. The Samaritans had their own Bible, 5 books, and they have numbers that match some of the other 2, and then some that are different even than them. And so the question has been for over 2,000 years, or maybe 1,800 years, 1,900 years or so, which numbers are the original? And this is important because we want to be able to date events properly, particularly the flood. That's one of the most important ones from an archaeological perspective. But also, we want to know of the approximate date of creation. We want to know what that is.
Yeah, and Henry, I'm sure you're going to talk about this. I don't want to get too far ahead of you, but it's also highly relevant because archaeologists and historians have used these discrepancies between what we actually find in history and what we see in the dirt in archaeology versus what the Masoretic tells us. Or, in other words, the dates that are presented to us in our modern Old Testaments, which come from that tradition, which greatly differ from what the prevailing theories are about history in the world of academia. And so,
That's
not
right.
to say that they're correct on everything, but it's just strange when the Bible is saying a completely different date than what they're saying. And it just gives them another reason to say the Bible, has no foundation in reality because it doesn't correspond to the reality that we see in our field of study, whether it's history or archaeology or whatever. And so I'm sure you're going to get to this, but in my
Sure.
experience of looking at the Septuagint, I think it aligns much better, maybe not perfectly, and maybe ancient history isn't perfect. Maybe it's a century or 2 off, as some people, David Roll and others have proposed with Egyptian chronology.
Yes.
But the fact that the Septuagint puts us in that ballpark where now things look like they're starting to line up, is also, I think, really significant. I'm sure you're going to talk about that at least a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. That is important. Of what we want, and one of the motivations for doing this was, well, if it should be interpreted chronologically, then we want to get the dates as close as we can, especially the flood, because then when we go do our work outside the Bible, if we're going to develop apologetic or historical or archaeological arguments, we want to be defending the right date. I think it's to the point that you're saying, if you have the wrong date, then you're going to have the wrong arguments to defend the wrong date, and we don't want that. We want to have it right. And so that's one of the most important aspects of this is, you know, determining what the proper dates are, and then doing your external work in relationship to that. And so, yes, I'm going to discuss some of that a little bit later, and what we see actually inside the biblical text itself. So
Oh, and I'm
that's a
also,
great point.
before you continue, I'm also
Sure.
having, I think Douglas Woodward.
I know of him. I don't know him personally.
So he did a lot of work with a lot of your work, and he has a couple of books that are out that really talk about the discrepancies and how, when you take into account the Septuagint, it really kind of lines things up from a historical standpoint. And then he goes into this whole aspect of the rabbinical conspiracy in the post first century time frame after Jesus, where um, the rabbis sort of conspired as Judaism at that time, post 70 AD, was falling apart, how they sort of conspired, as Christianity was rising, and the apostles and the early Christians were going out and they were using those Old Testament prophecies to prove that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah. They had to obscure things. They kind of changed some of the wording in some of those key messianic prophecies, and then also altered the dates. So I just think it's so appropriate that you're talking about this, and then he's going to come on, I guess, in a couple of weeks, hopefully,
Okay.
and talk about that. And it's going to be like part one and part two. So I just say that just to kind of give you give you guys in the audience something to look forward to.
Excellent. I'll have to watch that myself. I want to hear more of what he has to say. I've heard of him. I need to get his book and check it out. Also, I've been trying to get there, but you know how it is trying to do all the research. But yes, this is a very important point. I'm going to cover reasons why a little bit later in my presentation, why that often you said, use the word conspiracy, right? So when we use that word, people get like, yeah, conspiracy theories. But no, sometimes people actually do conspire together to bring about certain ends. And not all, quote, conspiracy theories are, tinfoil hat kind of stuff. If you have evidence that points to that as an explanation, and motivations for doing it, and historical circumstances that would be created for it to occur, then you can make a historical argument that that's an explanation for what happened to the text. And we're going to talk about that. So there's different ways to think about, conspiracy theories. There's good conspiracy theory in terms of good solid historical evidence, and then there's, a lot of stuff that is bad dot connecting and all that kind of thing. So
Right. It's one thing when the early Christians are actually recording that it happened and telling
yes,
you it happened,
that's
which
exactly right.
which I don't know if you're going to talk about, but I know he definitely talks about. So
Yeah, that's exactly right. We have ancient witnesses that discuss the very thing that you mentioned, and so we'll cover a little bit of that as well. So what we wanted to do, what I wanted to do with this, is dig into this, do a text critical investigation of these numerical divergences, and not only look at the manuscripts, but also external witnesses. There's lots of ancient authors who record the numbers from Genesis 5 and 11, make calculations. They had manuscripts in front of them that had those numbers in them. Which ones are they? Are they the longer chronology, the shorter chronology, etc.? Those kind of questions. These are really important external witnesses to the text. And I'm going to discuss in our time today the most ancient ones, so because they're the most significant. And then we want to be able to explain the data. Any theory that you put forth or a hypothesis, that has to have explanatory power. I've read a lot of literature, and you read an idea about why the numbers were changed, and it looks like a good idea, and then you run into a problem explaining a whole bunch of other data, and the theory can't explain it. So that's part of this too, is to be able to explain the data. And there's lots of it. It's not just the biblical manuscripts, but it's the external witnesses to the text. And so there's a lot to digest. Now I'm going to do my best to make it easy for folks. And then if they want to really dive deep, they can check out our website and have at it. Today, I'm going to focus mostly on the post-flood era, because this is where the evidence is most obvious. And for illustrative purposes, to illustrate what I think happened here in the past with these numbers. So we're going to do that. I'll talk about Genesis 5 as well, but we'll focus on 11 because it's actually more obvious what happened to the text in 11 than 5. 5 is a little bit more complicated. So now you can't see all those numbers up there on the screen, but the question is, which textual tradition preserves the original text? You can find this in the article that I wrote for the ICC back in 2018. I did a presentation at their conference going over all this. And again, you can see these numbers. And I have some better pictures of that for you as we walk along. So here's an overview. For the Masoretic text, you have time from Adam to the flood, 1656 years. From the flood to Abraham, 352, for a total of 2008. And if you're looking at our screen, you can see that the numbers in the Samaritan Pentateuch differ from the Masoretic text for all three, right? And in the Septuagint, same thing. We have differences in the time spans. Adam to the flood to Abraham. They all differ. But in the details, sometimes they match, sometimes they diverge. So you not only have the calculation for each epoch, right, and its total that differ, but you have also individuals that differ, but some that also match one another. So that's kind of what we're looking at. And as we alluded to, Mike, these time frames matter, especially this flood to Abraham period is particularly important because we can't do archaeology for the pre-flood world. It was the world that then was completely destroyed. So from a historical standpoint, that's the realm of the creation scientists and the geology and all that stuff. And that's really important. But from Genesis 9 forward is where we have archaeological evidence, and where the flood fits in that is really, really important. I'm going to zero in on the Masoretic text here. You know, the classic date from the Usher chronology, and there's variations of this, has been the creation was in 4004 BC and the flood was around 2348. I've proposed that the Septuagint preserves most of the original numbers, and that would put the flood around 3300 BC. And that's based largely on the reconstruction of Genesis in the Greek text by John William Weavers. He was a prolific Septuagint scholar, and I've made some slight modifications. His book was published in 1974 with every single known Septuagint manuscript of Genesis that was known to exist at that time. And so it's a depository of incredible information. It's very hard to read. It's like its own language set. So I had to learn how to read the thing, and it was written in German, so I had to, decipher it. But it is a magnificent depository of information, of the manuscript evidence there for us from the Septuagint tradition. So we have two phenomena I want to mention here. In the case of the numbers in Genesis 5 and 11, we have what are clearly large-scale deliberate alterations of the numbers by usually 100 years, and in one case 50 years. There's no question these are deliberate changes. They can't be accidental scribal errors. There are some scribal errors also in the tradition, especially in the Septuagint, because there were so many manuscripts that were copied, and numbers are easily corrupted by accident. The more manuscripts you have more slip-ups by scribes. And those are pretty easy to identify. So there's a difference between an accidental mistake and a deliberate alteration of the text. It's clear that the numbers have been changed. So the question historically has been, were they inflated? Or was the time frame inflated, or was it deflated? Which way did it go? You have original text. Which direction was it taken, and which one preserves it correctly? Obviously, we've let the cat out of the bag saying that, we believe the Septuagint preserves it, but we're going to share some of the reasons why. So here's a nice up-close picture of some of what we see here. Let's just take a look at Adam. We see in the Masoretic text, you can see my arrow pointing there, and the Samaritan Pentateuch, they match each other, the beginning age, and the remaining years, and the lifespans. But in the Septuagint, it's 230 years, and the remaining years is 700. So you can see there's a 100-year difference in each one. No question that it's been changed in one direction or the other. And that's pretty consistent through Genesis 5 until you get closer to the flood, in which case you see the Samaritan Pentateuch begins to then diverge pretty drastically from the other two witnesses. The numbers decrease, and the time frame shrinks as you get closer to the flood. And actually, Jared, Methuselah, and Lamech all die in the year of the flood in the Samaritan Pentateuch, which to me is evidence that that's been deliberately changed, that all three of those men die the same year as the flood. So there's a mixture of numbers that match and don't match, and then there's a change that takes place. Very, very complicated on the surface. it can be very bewildering. It was for me in the beginning. I had no idea, what am I going to do with all this data? I don't even know where to begin. And that's why I've been doing it for 10 years because of the amount of data. I'll share just one quick thing you see highlighted here. Lamech, he's unique because all of his numbers differ between the three textual traditions. So that just makes for even more of a complicated scenario to try to figure out, well, what happened? You see in the Septuagint, his begetting age when he had Noah was 188, but in the Hebrew text it's 182, and the Samaritan Pentateuch it's 53. So these numbers, there's a complicated mess going on there, but this kind of shows you that something significant has happened. They're probably a mixture of deliberate changes and accidental ones combined. Most likely, that's my theory. You will notice, by the way, Noah, all his numbers are exactly the same in all three. And my theory is that Noah, Abraham, Shem, those numbers were left unchanged because for Noah, his numbers are integrated with the flood chronology. So whoever changed it didn't want to have to tinker around with the flood chronology, so they left the numbers alone. And so, again, this is evidence of deliberate alteration. The ones they left alone is also evidence of that they didn't want to fool around with the complexities of the flood narrative. So they left Noah's alone, they left Shem's alone, they left Abraham's alone. They didn't do anything with those numbers. Okay, so now let's go to the post-flood period where it gets even more interesting. Now it's kind of flips. You know, the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Masoretic matched each other more before the flood, but now in the post-flood world, the Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch, well, they kind of match. They match the beginning ages almost all the way through, or almost perfectly matching. But the remaining years are different. The Samaritan Pentateuch has deflated them. That's very interesting. Then the Masoretic, the numbers are lower for the beginning ages, but the remaining years match the Septuagint. So what's going on there? A lot of questions that you have to ask. You know, why is that the case? If someone changed the Masoretic text, why didn't they change these numbers? Well, it may have been because there's no lifespans in the post-flood chronology in the Masoretic text and in the Septuagint. But you'll notice also that the Samaritan Pentateuch has added lifespans. These are actually added to the text, but were not in the Samaritan Pentateuch and Masoretic. We are certain that these are secondary numbers. These are not original to Moses. They were added later by a scribe for whatever reason. Maybe they wanted to mimic Genesis 5, which does include the lifespans. Very interesting. Not sure exactly, other than mimicking Genesis 5, exactly why they added all the lifespans, but that's what they did. So a lot going on there. So let's just keep a simple example for our audience. We'll pick Peleg. Peleg is very easy to analyze. So we'll zero in on one of the men in the post-flood world. You'll see here a comparison. His begetting age, that is the year that Ru is born, who's the next patriarch, is 30. But we see here that the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint both equal 130. And then the years that he lived after Ru was born, 209 in the Septuagint, but 109 in the Samaritan Pentateuch. And we see those consistent deflations in the Samaritan Pentateuch. So we can compare these and kind of see, well, which has the strongest evidence for originality? That's one of the questions we would want to ask. And we would also want to ask the question, well, you know, the Septuagint was done all the way down in Egypt, and the Samaritan Pentateuch was preserved by the Samaritans all the way up in northern Israel. And yet they have some of the same numbers. They didn't work together to make those numbers match. These are two separate communities of people. And so that's strong evidence of originality that points in that direction, because the Samaritans were not interested in the Greek Septuagint at all. They lived in a parochial society that was very closed-in kind of culture. They had their own Bible. And so this is part of the consideration that you have to you have to weigh as you're going through all of this. Now, as if we didn't have enough to be confused about, we have the unique case of Canaan. Now, Canaan is mentioned in Luke 33:36. Almost all the manuscripts of the New Testament of Luke's gospel have Canaan in Luke 3:36 between Arphaxad and Shelah, but Canaan is completely missing from the Masoretic text and the Samaritan Pentateuch. This is a completely independent, not completely independent, related, but independent research project, which I knew I was going to have to do. So I spent quite a bit of time doing that. I published 2 articles. The one on the left was a layman's version, the one on the right in the Detroit Baptist Seminary Journal, to try to figure out what's going on with Canaan. Was Canaan added to the New Testament? It shouldn't be there. Some people say it shouldn't be there. Why is he missing from the Masoretic text? Why is he missing from the Samaritan Pentateuch? Why is he in the Septuagint? Well, I give what I think is a pretty complicated but possible answer to that question. You don't have to go one way or the other with Canaan to understand the bigger picture that we're talking about here. But anybody that knows anything about the subject knows about the Canaan problem. And so I just decided that I wasn't going to shy away from it, that I wanted to know what the answer was to the problem. I discovered a lot of errors in the scholarship about Canaan, especially in the creationist literature. And so I encourage you to check that out. The Bible and Spade article is less technical, a lot of great pictures in that, and that's posted online if you want to see.
Are you able to give a quick summary of what you found?
Sure. Well, what I was I wanted to be careful not go down a rabbit trail, so I'll be careful here, Mike. One thing I discovered is a very early manuscript of Luke that has Canaan in it, and it's documented in the literature, but it's not documented in articles that are specifically talking about Canaan. And so a lot of people have said, "Oh, the early manuscripts don't have Canaan in it." That's not true. And the one manuscript, that New Testament manuscript that people said was Canaan was absent, I actually found it on the Vatican website, and you can't read it. You can't tell whether or not Canaan is missing or not. It's called P75. And so when the academics were arguing that Canaan was missing from P75, and that's an argument that it doesn't belong in Luke's gospel, it turned out you can't even read what the text says. It's the manuscript is mutilated at that point. I didn't know that until I did my investigation. And then you have to explain out, well, how did it get into the Septuagint? And my explanation is that it got into the Septuagint because it was in the Hebrew manuscript that the translators used in Egypt in the 3rd century BC. So
it should be there.
I think it should be there, but I have to explain why it disappeared from the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Masoretic text. And the only explanation that you could point to is that it had to disappear very early after the Babylonian exile. It's the only explanation. It would have to be a very early loss, and it's a lot of text. So at the end of my Detroit Baptist article, I try to show a plausible explanation of how the whole pericope was skipped over, because it's a lot of data. And some people have not been willing to buy that explanation, and I kind of understand why. But I wasn't able to find a better one in the literature. So I've told people, if you have a better explanation, I'm all ears. But I don't think the Septuagint translators just made it up. That is not consistent with the way that they treated the book of Genesis on the whole. It's also, Canaan is also in what's called the Book of Jubilees, which was written in 160 BC. His name is in there. And that means he was in a Hebrew text that the author of Jubilees was using.
Well, that's interesting.
60 BC.
And then what about the Dead Sea Scrolls? Is there anything do they help us with this? Or
no? No, that unfortunately we don't have anything from the Dead Sea Scrolls that helps us with Canaan. The only thing from the Dead Sea Scrolls that helps us is some fragments of Jubilees which don't have Canaan, but show that the 160 date of Jubilees' original authorship is probably right.
Okay.
You know, so that piece of evidence is very heavy. That Canaan is in Jubilees, and Jubilees originated in 160 BC. To me, it's evidence that it was in a Hebrew manuscript at that time period. That's very early. So fascinating. I didn't mean to go down a rabbit trail, but you asked.
I did ask because we couldn't leave that one undone. So
Okay,
going
good.
back to the point now.
Yes, no problem. So I just want to mention, and this is for all of you out there that are budding scholars or scholars. You can mine riches out of critical scholarship, but you got to be very careful about how you do it. I have found a lot of micro level gems in the critical scholarship, but their overarching theories about the Old Testament and its origin and development are incompatible with a high view of Scripture. So you got to pull the gold out of these works. So nothing wrong with using critical scholarship. You got to know what you're getting into when you do that. That's what I've tried to do. Ron Hendel, here's a quote from Ron Hendel. You know, they believe in the documentary hypothesis, essentially, right? That the Genesis was cobbled together after the fact by a bunch of redactors, and then it created all these chronological problems. So they tried to fix them. That's a completely secular view of the biblical text, which I reject, and I don't think the evidence supports that either. It's not just a philosophical or theological commitment. I don't think the evidence helps with that. But Hendel's documentation of the evidence is excellent, and so I've been able to pull that out of it. So just a little advice for those of you who might be pursuing seminary or Bible studies. So we need a different approach than critical scholars. Another area of research that I had to think through was what is the doctrine of preservation? What does the Bible teach us about preservation? Because some folks have objected to my theory that the Greek preserves the original numbers because they believe that it must be from a Hebrew manuscript. It has to be from a Hebrew manuscript. But when you actually study the doctrine of preservation and the verses in Scripture that allude to that or infer preservation, that's not required. God can preserve His word in any way He wants to in history. And sometimes that history is messy, but God is sovereign. And so while this can be sort of unsettling for some Christians, because we all want a straight line from the original author to the Bible we have in our hands today. Everybody wants a simple Bible that fell out of the sky, like the Quran, okay? Or supposedly the Quran, right? But I view this a little differently. My view is God preserves His word through the complexities of history, so He's the only one that gets the glory for preserving it. No church, no group, no ethnic group, no organization is responsible ultimately for the ultimate preservation of His word. God works through sinners and saints alike to preserve the Scriptures. And He even preserves the Scriptures through people like Josephus, Flavius Josephus, and other authors, where we find explicit quotations of the biblical text that help us to reconstruct the original. So God has at His disposal anything He wants to use to preserve His sacred word for us. And I have online in those at our website a whole presentation I did at Schaeffer Seminary a couple years ago on the transmission and preservation of Scripture, if people are interested in that. That's largely a theological discussion followed by an evidential presentation. So God preserves His word for us because if He didn't, we wouldn't be able to obey it. If His word is gone or aspects of it are gone, then how are we supposed to follow it? When we read the words of Jesus, we have to obey the words of Jesus, but we can only do that if it's been preserved for us. So it's complex, but very simple at the same time. And so I discussed that in that online video. Okay, so folks must be asking the question. You alluded to this earlier, Mike. the $1,000,000 question is, okay, who changed the text? Who did it? So some criteria that I kind of have developed, and as I've thought about this, one is motivation. What's your motive to change the text? A lot of times in the literature, you'll read these sort of motives that are kind of like, does that really rise to the level of somebody being willing to alter the sacred text? Most of the people who handled the sacred text believed that it was the word of God. And so and they knew the warning from Deuteronomy 4:2, don't change the word of God. Otherwise you'll come under a curse. Most ancient peoples, Christian and Jews, believe that. So whatever motivation you have, it's got to be enough to overcome that warning. You also have to be in a position to be able to disseminate the changes. You make the changes to the chronology, and then you've got to disseminate them into your religious community. So you have to have some kind of authority. You can't be just some random scribe who decides to change the numbers, because the next scribe who gets the manuscript is going to go, this is all messed up. I'm not passing this on. Somebody changed all of it.
And you're going to have texts all over the place that contradict it. So they're just going to throw yours out because they can compare it to any of the 100 that they have available. And they know that you're the imposter.
That's exactly right. It's a great point, Mike. And so you have to have a centralized authority that has control over the manuscript tradition, and then you have to be able to disseminate it into your religious community, and the people, the lay people, have to sort of buy it, as it were, if you want to say it that way. So you have to have the sort of the stature to be able to do that, and then you have to be in a set of historical circumstances, both historical and theological. What would be the reason why you would change the chronology? Is there a theological rationale behind changing it? And are the historical circumstances, do they allow for you to change it? When we look at the Septuagint, for example, a lot of people say, the Septuagint translators changed the text, but we don't really see any evidence of that. And then once the Septuagint went out into the wider Jewish diaspora, nobody had any control over the Septuagint. There was no centralized authority that had control over it at all. So if you see consistency in its preservation dispersed, that's more likely pointing to originality, as opposed to a narrow group of men who are able to control the tradition. So this is kind of like some of the ways that I've tried to reason through this. Let me give you a real quick, probably if those out there have heard of some of this before, have heard the idea that the Alexandrian translators inflated Genesis 5 and 11 to reconcile it with Egyptian chronology. That's a very common argument. So they had their manuscripts, they matched the Masoretic text, they inflated the chronology because of external pressures of what the Egyptians were saying about their history. It's a very common argument. So there's a couple things that make this argument not work. One is that the Jews used the Septuagint for several centuries after it was translated. And all of them, before the destruction of the temple, used the longer chronology. And there's no evidence that they had a problem with the longer chronology, which would have been circulating everywhere else if they had manipulated it. So they simply wouldn't have been able to get away with it, because they wouldn't have been able to deal with Hebrew texts up in Israel or anywhere else, for that matter, or in Babylon. So they just were not in a position to control the other manuscripts that were out there. So they couldn't have gotten away with it. There's no ancient testimonies that make this claim. We don't have
Well, they also couldn't, correct me if I'm wrong, they also
Yes.
couldn't have gotten the Samaritans to go along with it on many of their ages.
Yes, well, particularly for the post-flood period.
Okay.
Right, they would have had to twist their arms in some way to do that, and that actually is a very good point. The Samaritans were completely divorced from the Septuagint, right? So in Genesis 11, the beginning ages match each other. The time frame is almost the same except for Canaan. So that's exactly right. So that's
they historically they were no friends of the rabbis,
mainstream
the ancient
Judaism.
Jews. They were at odds, so they're not going to go along with them on that. Yeah.
Yes. Yep. That's good. That's an excellent point. Right. So we don't have anybody in the ancient world saying that the Septuagint translators changed the numbers. Nobody. I haven't been able to find that until the 19th century. That's the earliest claim I have found. Now, there may be an earlier claim that I haven't discovered in literature, but 1831 or 41, somewhere in there, is the earliest author I have found that says that this is what happened. That's too late. You got to have something earlier than that, in my view. And it fails to achieve the specified goal. The chronology of the Egyptian priest Manetho, for example, is as it was known back then, is longer than the Septuagint's chronology. So in other words, the Septuagint translators did a lousy job of inflating it. They needed to inflate the chronology much more to bring it in line with the chronology of Manetho. And there were other Egyptian chronologies that were even longer than this. So in other words, their apologetic purpose, they failed at, if that's what they were trying to do. It didn't work. And so that just tells you that that's not what happened. They didn't do that. And as I said right there on the slide is exactly what I just said there. It just doesn't do the job. When you look through the literature of Old Testament and textual scholars and Septuagint scholars, they all say the numbers in the Septuagint came from the Hebrew text, not the translators. So they have a Hebrew manuscript. It's laying on their table. They're translating it into Greek. They're copying the numbers over. The numbers didn't originate at that point in time. They were already in the manuscript that they were using.
So the fact that the Septuagint is in Greek should not be evidence that they don't preserve the original because it comes from the Hebrew. That's what you're saying?
Yeah, that's right. And I can add to that, Mike. That's a great point. Numbers are actually one of the easiest things to translate. Adam's age, 930, in Hebrew, you just translate and you write 930 in Greek. It's not like translating poetry or
You don't have to figure out the intended meaning.
difficult vocabulary, right? All the problems that are associated with translation disappear when it comes to numbers. All you got to do is just translate it over. So it's the easiest thing to translate. 930 is 930 in Hebrew, in Greek, in Syriac, in English. It's a very simple thing. So there's the translational issue is not an issue at all. And so it wouldn't have been a problem. Now, here's a quote from a world-renowned scholar of the biblical text, Emmanuel Tove. He says, this is an example that I'm drawing on from the literature. The details, meaning the numbers, should not be ascribed to the translator, but the Hebrew vorlage. They did not go as far to recalculate the logic or the system of the lists. And he goes on to say that basically the translators of Genesis treated the text very conservatively when they translated it. They treated it with a high degree of respect. They had some problems with some of the Hebrew, and it's not a perfect translation, but it's a conservative translation. And so if you look at the totality of Genesis, there's nothing telling you that they would have been willing to radically alter the chronology in the way that's suggested by the idea that the Septuagint was inflated. And then the Septuagint version, as you alluded to, has much in common with the Samaritan Pentateuch, especially Genesis 11. So strengthening the assumption that the phenomenon took place at the Hebrew level. So the evidence is pretty strong that the Septuagint translators did not change the numbers. So that theory, in my judgment, doesn't work. The numbers were in the Hebrew text. And that puts us back 280 BC. That's pretty far, pretty early as far as the evidence goes. And again, here I mentioned that Genesis 11, Samaritan Pentateuch, and the Greek text, they match each other. And you can see that here. Just for the beginning ages, we can see how they match one another down the line for the most part. Okay, just to illustrate that for our audience. So now I mentioned earlier also, Mike, that we have external witnesses. What I call these are snapshots. So you got somebody basically writing a Bible commentary, okay, of some sort. It's either chronology or prose, whatever it is. He's got biblical manuscript in front of him, and he's writing about the Bible. We have 4 witnesses fundamentally before the destruction of the temple. Josephus is around 90, but his manuscripts are certainly earlier than the destruction of the temple. Almost certainly, the possibility that they actually came from the temple is a possibility.
And the dating that you just pointed out is so significant as evidence, because what at least I'm suggesting, I don't want to speak for you, what I know
Sure.
my guest who I'm going to be having on shortly suggests is that the changes took place shortly after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, in that time frame, in that scenario where Christianity was ascending and Judaism at the time was falling apart. So all of this takes place prior to that. So it's significant.
That's right. In my judgment, based on all the evidence, the destruction of a temple kind of serves as a line of demarcation with the historical evidence. All of a sudden, in the 2nd century, the shorter chronology starts showing up. Is kind of fundamentally what we see happening. And so that's important. So a way to test the theory, right, is to look at these pre-temple witnesses. What did they say about Genesis 5 and 11? What did they write as far as the individual numbers or an overarching chronology? What do they have to say? Well, we have 4 of them, and they're all very significant. So let me tell you guys a little bit about them, because these are a key component. And as I mentioned earlier, this is like a forensic investigation, right? You look at the manuscripts, but then you have these other witnesses to the text that can help us sort through this. Here's one of the most interesting and not well-known witnesses. This book, I call it Lab. It's called Liber Antiquitatum Biblicarum. Lab is much easier to say. It kind of recapitulates history of the Bible from Adam to Saul. And it has parallels from non-canonical Jewish traditions. But what's fascinating is in the first chapter, it cites the begetting ages and the remaining years, not the lifespans, the remaining years, which are unusual. A lot of witnesses didn't record those. They would usually record the begetting ages and the lifespans. But Lab records the begetting ages and remaining years from Seth to Lamech. And those numbers are in accord with the Septuagint's numbers in Genesis 5. So you go, okay, you got this guy, he's writing this basically commentary from Adam to Saul. He's adding in some Jewish traditions, but he's recording numbers from the manuscript that he's got sitting in front of him. And so it's kind of hard to see this up on the screen. It's in the work that I've done, but over on the right-hand side, I document the numbers that were recorded in this work.
And
Now,
if you guys want to look deeper into these charts, like Henry just said, some of them might be hard to make out on this video recording, but all of this information is going to be in the links that I mentioned at the beginning of the episode. Those are going to be in a pinned comment. So just look for this. You guys can look through this on your own time.
Excellent. So, and again, try to be transparent in documenting all of this. What's interesting now, so Lab is actually written in Latin. So now some people have tried to make there was an intermediate version of it in Greek, but it's been studied extensively, and all the scholars that have studied Lab extensively agree that the original text of Lab was actually written in Hebrew, and it was taking information from Hebrew manuscripts of the Bible during its discourse from Adam to Saul. Now, it's not telling all the story from Adam to Saul. It's being selective in what it's choosing in terms of its commentary, and that it originated in the 1st century, possibly before the time of Jesus. The main scholarship on this is crystal clear. There's 3 main commentaries that have been written over the last 100 years on it, and they pretty much all agree with, even in the early days when this was first discovered, that this originated as a Hebrew text, and they've been able to determine that through intensive study. I've read through the commentary. The arguments make a lot of sense to me. So I think there's good grounds for that. Now, some people, want to say, oh, no, they got the numbers from a Septuagint manuscript. That's where these numbers came from. They didn't come from a Hebrew text. But here's Jacobson. He says, it would be hard to understand why someone who could write such a skillful Hebrew prose in biblical style and clearly had an expert knowledge of the Bible would have felt the need or desirability of consulting a translation of the Bible. So the person who wrote this knew Hebrew, was writing it from a Hebrew text, and recorded the numbers that are in the longer chronology, and they were in a Hebrew text as well. And that is consistent with the Septuagint's recording of the numbers from its original Hebrew text. Fascinating piece of work, fascinating part of the puzzle. One of the little pieces of evidence, it's interesting, that comes out of this, that Lab did come from a Hebrew original, is Lamech's begetting age. Lamech's begetting age in Lab is 182 years. If you were taking these numbers from the Septuagint, you would have written 188, because all the Septuagint manuscripts have 188. So this points us, this is how you kind of have to really dig into the evidence. This agrees with the scholarship. Lamech's begetting age is only in the Masoretic text, a Hebrew text, and that means that's consistent with the fact that all of it comes from the Hebrew text being used by the author. Really interesting piece of data there. So we have Lab. Now we're gonna kind of work our way. We don't know exactly when Lab was written, sometime in the 1st century, but we know Josephus was written around 90 or so. Josephus, the longer chronology, Genesis 5 and 11, appears in Antiquities of the Jews. And again, those who think that, many people think that Josephus was just recording the numbers in the Septuagint. But when you dig into the Josephus scholarship, you find something quite different. You have to examine it very carefully, that he was just parroting the Septuagint numbers. But actually, when you read a number of different things, you find out something different. One is you have overarching statements about the history of the Bible, 5,000-year statements, I call them. And that's too long for the Masoretic's chronology in Genesis 5 and 11. This only fits the longer chronology. The things narrated in the sacred scriptures are embrace the history of 5,000 years. So he's talking about from Adam to about 400 BC to Artaxerxes. So he's talking about the history of the Bible, not up to his time, but to the kind of the end of the canon. So he's just kind of calculating a chronology and saying it's about 5,000 years.
So it goes far beyond just copying the numbers. His whole understanding was based on something that's only compatible with that longer chronology in the Septuagint, is what you're saying.
That's
and
exactly
that
right.
would have been well known across the board at large in that Hebrew community of his time. And he was actually acting as a representative of what was commonly known at his time in the Hebrew community. So he wouldn't be coming out saying something that's contradicted by everyone, because he'd be called out on it. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. It's a good way to put it. I mean, like if the shorter chronology existed in the manuscripts, people would have been saying, this is 3,600 years, not 5,000. What's he talking about? Right? He's got the numbers wrong. That's a big 1,400 years is a huge difference in the time calculation. It'd
be like if a Christian came out today and came out with some kind of new ending to the book of Acts, let's say, we'd all call him out right off the bat.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you have these other independent witnesses that fit it as well, which we'll get to. We have two more after we talk about Josephus. So he's got overarching statements, and he has also other statements that where he says specifically, "I'm using a Hebrew text." And modern scholars who are expert on Josephus, I've consulted numerous modern scholars because I wanted to know, what do the experts on Josephus say about the kind of text that he was using when he sat down at his proverbial desk? They argue that he had a Hebrew text of Genesis when he wrote Antiquities. That's what he was primarily using. He did refer to the Septuagint in later books, but the consensus is that in the early books of the Bible, he was using a Hebrew text, and they based that on the linguistic analysis and his translation of, because he's writing in Greek, he's translating from the Hebrew to Greek. And, Josephus has been studied so intensely and so deeply and for so long. The scholarship, it's just a rich deposit for us to go through. And it was fairly easy for me. It took some time, but once I was able to read through it and understand what the scholars were saying, it was clear to me that we could make a good case that Josephus had a Hebrew text of Genesis sitting in front of him when he recorded the chronology. So some examples are Henry Thackeray, who's an early 20th century Septuagint scholar and an expert on Josephus. Josephus used a, quote, Semitic text for Genesis through Ruth. Louis Feldman, he actually documents how Lab, which we just previously discussed, and the Hebrew text that Josephus used are closely related to one another. And then Naudet is a French scholar. He believed that the Hebrew source that Josephus used was pretty close to the one used by the Septuagint translators. So that's very interesting. So the consensus of the Josephus scholarship is that he was using basically a Hebrew Bible. And so when we go through his recitation of the numbers, we see that they match the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint. Here's just the example in Genesis 11 that I'm giving up here on the screen of how close they are. There's some scribal errors in Josephus, and there's some attempts in the manuscripts to change some of the numbers, but overall, the work that's been done on the Josephus manuscripts is top notch. In my article for the ICC, I work off of Thackeray's work, and then with a couple of small modifications of my own, but largely I draw on Thackeray. His arguments to me are airtight, the way that they read. Longer chronology, Josephus translated it, and you can also see it in the names of the patriarchs. The names are spelled differently than they are in the Septuagint text. And so that's an indication that Josephus is trying to transliterate over from the Hebrew into Greek, but the spellings of the names, like Noah's name, is different in a Septuagint manuscript. If he was using a Septuagint manuscript, he would have been likely just to write the name that was in the Septuagint. And so that's an indication that he's translating from a Hebrew text when he's recording the chronology. Very important witness. Josephus is so important for the history of the church. Just wonderful that God has preserved so much through him. It's so interesting.
Yeah, I've got his full work sitting on my shelf here. It's a great addition. If you guys are building your library, definitely get your hands on that.
Yep. And in my ICC article, I try to draw on the best of the Josephus scholarship and the most recent scholarship as well. So you can check that out if you like. Now we have another author from around 160 BC. His name was Apollonius. He was an aristocrat. He was from Jerusalem, and now he just calculates a creation date. He doesn't document all the individual begetting ages, but when you translate it to a BC date, you get about 5,307 BC. And the scholarship on Apollonius is clear that he knew Hebrew and Greek, and he had access to both Hebrew and Greek texts. So if they were in disagreement with each other, it would be a problem for him doing his creation date. But you can assume from the fact that he gives this creation date that they were basically in accord with each other. And that's pretty certain. To me, that seems pretty certain. Now, the date isn't giving us the detailed numbers. He doesn't document that. So we don't have that from Apollonius. He lived in Jerusalem. He was an aristocrat. Technically, he may have had access to the scrolls in the temple. We don't know that for sure, but he could have. He wasn't just some guy living in a cave somewhere. He was well known and recorded as such. So another fascinating witness. A Greek he's a Greek historian. He calculates 5,149 years from Adam to the 5th year of the reign of Demetrius I. So his calculations are slightly different than Josephus, a little bit shorter of a time frame, but not short enough for the Masoretic text, to be sure. You'll find minor disagreements amongst these chronologists about certain interpretations, but the point is, you can't fit the Masoretic chronology with Apollomus either. And so, and his creation date actually matches Demetrius, the chronographer, who we're going to talk about now. And so, let's talk about Demetrius, because Demetrius is the oldest datable Alexandrian Jewish author that we know of. So he is writing Bible commentary, and he's called a chronographer because he liked chronology, and he records quite a bit of it in his work. He lived around 220 BC. So this would be very shortly after the time that the Septuagint was translated. So we have here a very early witness to the Genesis text. And as one scholar says, his knowledge of its contents is detailed and exact. And so it's interesting here, we have fragments that have been preserved through other authors, and we have these data points that we can sort of collate together to figure out, well, what were some of the numbers in his Septuagint manuscript of Genesis 5 and 11. So he calculates the time from Adam to Joseph, and from the deluge, meaning the flood, to Joseph's arrival in Egypt. He talks about Abraham's excursion from Ur and his trip to Canaan through Haran. And so he gives all of these calculations in his work. So we can look at that and go, okay, well, what did his manuscripts say? It's really fascinating. When you break it down, when you do the math, you just look at the blue here to get down to the bottom line, you get from the flood to the birth of Abraham 1,072 years exactly in his calculations. Well, it turns out that this is exactly what the post-flood chronology is, with the inclusion of Canaan in it. So Demetrius is...
You're talking about in the Septuagint.
In the Septuagint text, that's right.
So it's identical.
It's identical to the Septuagint text, and it must include Canaan to equal the 1,072 years. So you can infer from this that Demetrius's Septuagint text had Canaan in it, which is really interesting. And we can know that
Samaritan Pentateuch did not have Canaan, but if you inserted Canaan into it, it would also be identical to the year of Demetrius of Alexandria and the Septuagint, is what you're saying.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Wow. That's compelling.
Yeah, it really is, right? Samaritan Pentateuch, the time is 942. We'll add Canaan to that. You get 1072. You get 1072 for the post-flood chronology. You get 1072 for the Demetrius calculation. And then to add to it, you have In a City of God by Augustine, 1072. So...
And that's 4th century AD?
Early 5th. So a little later, but
that was it's based on the fact that those were the Bibles being used in the early church, the Septuagint, the time of Jesus and immediately after.
Yes, that's exactly right. And you see the continuity of the preservation of the text too.
Right.
So you have Demetrius to Augustine is about 600 years. And you see how, while we do have manuscripts that have errors that got introduced by accident and so forth, you also see a consistency of the preservation. The preservers of the text tried to preserve the text the best that they could. And, there's Augustine sitting there writing City of God, and he's got numbers that match exactly what Demetrius said 600 years before that. So to me, this is very compelling evidence. The thing that's compelling about Demetrius, of course, is he's our earliest witness to Genesis 5 and 11. We see here with the survey of this evidence. Now, in the case of Demetrius, he's only using the Greek text. He doesn't know Hebrew as far as we know. But Apollomus knew Hebrew, and Josephus knew Hebrew, and the author of Lab knew Hebrew. So we have Greek in Demetrius, Greek and Hebrew in Apollomus, Hebrew with Josephus, Hebrew with Lab, all the longer chronology, all early.
So Demetrius was using the Septuagint, or he was drawing on what was already well known more broadly?
Well, no. I probably should be more clear about that. I apologize. The best that we know, it does not look like Demetrius knew Hebrew. So he only knew Greek, and therefore was only drawing on the Septuagint itself. What he knew about Hebrew text around him, we don't know.
Okay.
But his witness is so early, that's what makes it so important, and it's consistent with these other witnesses as well. So that's really significant. But the thing I should emphasize is the reason I mentioned these four witnesses is because the power of, the cord of four strands, if you want to say it that way, right? It's not just one person over here. If it was just Demetrius, you go, okay, that's important evidence, but then you start adding these other witnesses to the text in different places. Josephus has been deported to Rome. He's got Bibles with him, or a biblical text with him. Demetrius is in Alexandria. Apollonius is in Jerusalem, right? And Lab is somebody who lives in Israel. So you've got, people dispersed coming up with basically the very similar calculations. And then the Samaritan Pentateuch to boot, as it relates to the post-flood calculation. So it's really a powerful set of arguments, and it's one of the reasons why I've been persuaded to the longer chronology being the original, because of not only the nature of these witnesses, but how early they are.
Well, it would be a lot
History.
harder to prearrange deliberately all of what you just said, rather than what we propose is that, well, I won't get ahead of you, but
That's all right. That's
but
all right.
you know where I'm going with that.
There's no way that could be controlled by a central authority, what I just described, because it's too dispersed. They're a couple centuries apart from one another. They're different ideologies, right? Like
Geographically, it's
geographic.
completely decentralized, and yet there's
Exactly.
agreement that
Yes.
just can't be contrived.
That's exactly right. That's what makes it so powerful evidence from a forensic standpoint. You just try to be, can this be a coincidence that works? And it's no, it can't be coincidental. Um, and as we're mentioning here now, when we look at the post-flood chronology for the Masoretic text, which is 352 years, right? It's considerably shorter period of time from the flood to Abraham. We just simply do not have the kind of evidence that we're talking about. We have no witnesses that are reliable, that preserve the Genesis 11 chronology in any kind of way, in detail or in specific calculation from the flood to Abraham. We simply don't have any. Now, some people
But
might say,
I think I brought this up before, but
yes,
do we not have, so you're saying that the Dead Sea Scrolls do not help us in any way, in this, um, search for trying to understand what was the original? They don't
no,
preserve Genesis 11
or
and Genesis
five.
5?
Nope.
Okay.
It would
So if
be,
that was discovered one day, that would be like a
well,
cinch.
if let's put it this way, you put a theory to a test. If you found a Dead Sea Scroll in Hebrew written before the destruction of the temple, and it had the shorter chronology, it would blow my theory up. I don't think you would find it, but it would put the theory to the test. So it's a testable theory. You find a manuscript from before the time of the destruction of the temple with the numbers from Genesis 5 and 11. It's gonna point, either it's gonna refute my thesis or it would support it.
And it
But it
still
would be
doesn't
pretty
tell
clear.
it still doesn't determine what the original was. It just refutes the theory that the rabbinic, leaders changed it post 70 AD.
That's right. That is correct. That's true, it would refute that part of the theory,
Because
the
you
idea
still
that the
have
rabbis changed it.
contrasting numbers. You still don't know what the
Correct.
original is. We would
Yes,
just have to work on a new theory. Okay,
that
gotcha.
is correct. Yeah, excellent. Thank you for making that clearer.
Mm.
That's very good. So now, again, I just want to emphasize here, people may be alarmed by a little bit, maybe by what I'm saying, suggesting again here with the doctrine of preservation doesn't demand that all the words of Scripture are preserved only in the Hebrew language. We have evidence anyway that these texts were in Hebrew, various different ways, translated over into the Greek. And this was the Bible of the early church. It was the Bible of the Jewish diaspora until the church came along. I mean, the Jews used the Septuagint text, and they used a longer chronology because Demetrius, Apollonius, Josephus, and the writer of Lab were all Jews. So they were all using the longer chronology in various ways. I think it's a powerful set of evidence, as I've alluded to several times. So conversely, we don't have, focusing on Genesis 11, any witnesses to the chronology from the flood to Abraham that supports the Masoretic text before the 2nd century. Just there's no evidence.
Yeah,
Of
and
that.
it's just not convincing to say that the only text for preservation has to be Hebrew, because we know that even the Old Testament wasn't completely written in Hebrew. There was Aramaic portions, and then the
Yes,
whole New Testament was written in Greek. So
right.
obviously the Lord can use Greek to reach us. So it's
Yes.
just that would be a strange argument.
Yeah, it is often based on, when Jesus says something like, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. I tell you that not one jot or tittle of the law will pass away until all these things are fulfilled. People take that reading of the jot and the tittle as being sort of a hyper literal uh, understanding of preservation, that Jesus is saying all the words are in Hebrew.
Mm.
But that's not the point that Jesus is making there. He's just saying that every aspect of the law, down to the tiniest part of it, is important and binding, and only through me will it be fulfilled. That's the point that Jesus is making. He's not giving us a mechanical description of the doctrine of preservation. And so that text has been misused, in my judgment, to try to make the argument that I was saying about it only can be in Hebrew, drawing on those words of Jesus. But I don't think that's a proper understanding of what Jesus is alluding to there.
Right, and it's the same argument that, some, like, Sabbatarian and, like, Hebrew roots folks use to say that we're still under the law. So it's a misapplication
Yes.
just in a
Yeah.
different direction.
Yep. Yep. We have to be so discerning and careful about how we interpret the Bible, with wisdom, the Holy Spirit. And there's always so many different ways that it can be distorted and twisted. And it's a warning to us, Mike, to be alert, to be careful, to rightly handle the word of truth. Like all of those things, we have to be so careful about it, but not to the point of that we say, well, we can't know what God meant. We don't want to go that far either. No, no, God has given us the word so that we can understand it properly, right? I mean, you think about Peter. If I give just a quick aside here, you think about Peter's condemnation of false teachers, that they twist the scriptures to their own destruction, is what he says. It implies that the true meaning of it was accessible to them, but they decided to twist the text instead. That's the implication, right, from that. And they're saying that they're twisting Paul's words in particular, right? He says that some of what Paul teaches is difficult, but he doesn't say that what Paul teaches is impossible. So some of it's hard. You got to dig deep, but God has given us the word so we can understand it. It's not some esoteric mystery that we can't understand. It's for His people, or as Paul says in Romans 15, these things were written for our instruction, right? So anyway, a little side note there on the clarity of Scripture. It's important to understand Scripture's qualities and its own testimony about itself, and how Jesus handled it as well. So, but I don't want to run off too much on a rabbit trail. Mike, you've been so gracious so far to allow me to really flesh this out. So I shared before a little bit about Peleg. I want to use Peleg as a simpler example of my methodology of how I came to some of these conclusions in Genesis 11. So let me illustrate it for you. Okay. So we're just going to use Peleg. We're going to go to this slide. We have Peleg's remaining years in both the Masoretic and the Septuagint match, but in the Samaritan Pentateuch, it's deflated to 109. The conclusion is the SP's numbers are not original. They've been systematically deflated. We're not exactly sure why. I'm not 100% sure why the Samaritan Pentateuch has done this, but they did. Okay. And it's clear from these separate witnesses, the Masoretic and the Septuagint, that 209 is the right number for the remaining years of his life. Okay. Now we move to the Masoretic text. The begetting age for Peleg is 30. Now we have no attestation to this until the 2nd century AD. That's important. We've alluded to this numerous times. So let me show you the preponderance of the evidence. In the Septuagint, in other witnesses, we have 130 in 6 sources prior to the year 100. We have Josephus. We have, it's necessarily part of Apollomus's chronology. He's got the longer chronology. He has to have the longer begetting age in there. The Samaritan Pentateuch has 130. Demetrius's calculation must have the 130. The Septuagint has 130. And the Hebrew text that the Septuagint translators were using had to have 130. And if we might say that Hebrew text, unless it was a brand new scroll, let's say it was 20 or 30 or even 40 years old, might even point us back into the previous century in terms of what it's attesting to, right? That's a little bit of a guess, but it seems reasonable to me. So if the Septuagint was translated in 280, the Hebrew text they were using might be from 300 BC. So when we put it on the scale, we're sitting in a courtroom and we're saying, okay, which one is the original? We have 6 witnesses prior to the year 100 that point to 130, either explicitly or indirectly. And we have 1 witness, the Masoretic text, that points us to 30. Okay, so this is kind of the approach that I've tried to take in weighing the evidence, right?
So are you calling the Masoretic text a pre-AD 100 source?
No, the Masoretic is post 100.
Right. So I just wanted people to be aware of that.
Yes.
So he's saying that there are 6 pre-100 AD sources saying one thing versus the Masoretic, which is what you see in your Bible today, which is from well after that.
That's correct. Probably my estimate is probably the middle of the 2nd century is about when these numbers were changed, is my estimation. 140, 150 AD, somewhere in that range. We can't know for sure unless we find some new evidence that tells us exactly. So now, as we continue on, so just follow the logic of what I'm saying. So now we've got all of this evidence of 130, and we talked about the remaining years already, that they're in the Masoretic and the Septuagint 209. So you add the 2 of them together, the lifespan is 339. Okay, and we know that the Samaritan Pentateuch has added lifespans. The lifespans are not original in Genesis 11. They have been added to the text at some later point in time. So now we can conclude also that the lifespan in the Samaritan Pentateuch is also wrong. And we know that also because the remaining years have been deflated to 109. You see, so we kind of take the whole matrix of the evidence, kind of put it together, what makes the most sense, what's the most independent, bring it all together and see what are the right numbers for Peleg. So we end up with this sort of logic. Now, to me, this is powerful evidence that the Masoretic numbers are wrong. If you calculate the lifespan, it's 100 years too short. The only number there in the Masoretic that's been preserved is the 209. They didn't change that. And so the conclusion, in my view, is that Peleg's beginning age of 30 in the Masoretic text is incorrect, based on all the matrix of evidence that we take a look at. All right. So now we've alluded to the rabbis here numerous times, and we want to get to that. We want to talk about some evidence. Well, why would they do that? Why does Genesis 5 and 11 matter as it relates to the church? I mean, why does that matter? We're going to get to that because that's part of the introduction you did to the show, right, Mike? But I want to show a couple really important points here internally to the text of the Bible itself. I'm not appealing to archaeological evidence or external evidence. I'm a point to the internal result of the Masoretic chronology in Genesis 11. It betrays evidence that it's been systematically deflated. I'm going to allude to this in a couple different ways. the timeline from the flood to Abraham is far too short to allow for an adequate population growth from the flood to Babel, followed by the dispersal of language groups and the subsequent development of civilizations in the cultures that are described from Genesis 10 onwards. Now, I know some creation ministries have run population calculations, but they made the numbers work so that you could have a large group of people as far as a number goes. But it's more complicated than that. It's not just about the number. It's about the dispersion. It's about the settlement of cities, the establishment of civilizations, and all the time that's required for all of that to occur in the early post-flood world is just too short in the Masoretic text. And this
Henry, I have to say this. It's one of my frustrations with these creation ministries is that they spend so much of their valuable time and energy and resources trying to fight an uphill battle against so many scenarios that just, I mean, common sense tells you they just don't work coming from the Masoretic text. And so you would think at some point, why don't you just go back, look at the Septuagint, and all of a sudden, so many of these problems just dissipate. So maybe it's just that you're defending the wrong chronology.
yeah,
I mean, why won't they just look at the Septuagint? Surely they're
sure.
aware of this debate and this issue. Why won't they just look at it and say, well, clearly those are the original numbers. What's the problem with that?
Well,
Why
there's been
won't they just do that?
there's been a couple different responses. One is um, there is of roadblock with accepting that the rabbis could have done this to the text. Like that's a hard pill for some people to swallow. They just have a difficult time accepting. And in fact, I should say I didn't say
Yet they
this.
crucified Jesus.
Well, that is part of my argument. Is that this is the same? These are the religious descendants of the men who crucified Jesus, and also were actively going out into the diaspora to oppose the gospel. So if they were willing to crucify Jesus, they were willing to persecute the church. Um, the idea that they would have been willing to change the numbers in the text, to me, is not a far stretch. But some people have a hard time with it. I wrestled with this for about a year, but I kept going back to the idea because it was the only theory that I found that could explain all the evidence. So eventually, I just gave up fighting it because every time I returned to it, it helped me to explain the data. So for the person out there who might be struggling with it, I get it. I kind of went through it myself, but I just came back to the same conclusion every time, that this was what made the most sense. The other part is, this is a guess on my part. There's been a long-term commitment to the Usher chronology, the 4004 BC by some of the creation ministries. I would imagine that if they tried to pull back from that, that would create a lot of headaches and tension from their supporters, from some, perhaps, and that would be a difficult infighting within the ministry. There probably would be people that would not go for that. I would guess. When you make a major change like that within an organization, it can be very difficult and stressful. So now I'm not saying I know that. It's human nature. We don't like change. Some of them have critiqued some of my arguments, don't like some of my arguments. We've had a little banter back and forth. We try to remain respectful. I'm not really convinced by much of what the pushback has been. In fact, the pushback has just made me sort of dig deeper to make sure that I wasn't making errors. I actually found an error, a pretty big size one. It didn't affect my overall theory, but I published a retraction on it, so that was healthy. I came out and just said, look, I messed this up. Here it is. This is what I think I did wrong. But it really doesn't, this particular data point doesn't change what my argument is. So it is, maybe there's a commitment to this millennial calculation, the 6,000 years, the return of Jesus. I don't know that, but it could be. It could be a factor that's influencing. So it's a really good question. But I do think I once I started thinking about this and thinking about the Septuagint and the longer chronology, and then I started digging into it. To me, it just became something that I want to know the truth. Whatever the answer was going to be, that's what I want to know. And I'm sure most of your audience, if not all of them, they want the truth too. We want to know. I want to know what the original numbers were that God gave to Moses. That's what I want to know. If it turned out to be the Masoretic text, so be it.
Right.
Right. So be it. Like if that's what it was, then that's what it is, and we defend the Bible from that perspective. I would have been fine with that.
Yeah, and we'll fight every battle that needs to be fought.
Right. But be
But
sure it's the battle you should fight.
That's exactly right. I
Yeah.
mean, don't waste your time spinning your wheels fighting unnecessary battles when it's
Yes.
probable or likely that you're actually just operating from the wrong chronology.
Yep. Yep. So to that end, in the internal evidence alone, and when we get to the Abrahamic narratives, there's 26 cities in Canaan that are mentioned. We have all of the civilizations and cities that you see up here on the screen that are already established, well-established political entities by the time you even get to the birth of Abraham. So the time period is in the Masoretic is just short. So when you look internally to Scripture, what it's saying about the development of civilizations in a 350-year period, it's pretty hard to get not only enough people. You would have to have really high reproductive rates, which is possible because you had people living for a long time still in the post-flood world. But the dispersion and where you put Babel in this is another question that has to be answered. And so I just see these as incongruities within the text that don't make sense.
Yeah, that's another thing that I don't want to detract too much here, but I'll
Sure.
throw it in. I did a big study, multi videos a while back on Nimrod and the Tower of Babel, and one of the things that I uncovered in my research that I talked about in the videos was the fact that according to the Masoretic chronology, Babylon, if you're understanding Babel to be the Babylon that we think of today, was not even around at the right time if you're using the Masoretic text. But if you use the Septuagint, then it was around at the right time if you
Yeah.
understand that it was probably the city called Eridu. And that fits the chronology perfectly. And there's a lot of evidence that shows that it actually was Babel that's described in those early chapters in Genesis.
Yeah.
But the whole timeline gets thrown off completely, assuming the Masoretic.
Yeah, what and if you start looking at some of that external evidence, which I haven't done a lot of, I'm in agreement with you that we do need to look at that as a subcomponent of the argument. I've deliberately avoided the external archaeology because I don't want to be accused of holding the archaeology over the text, right? I'm in agreement with what you're saying, but methodologically, I've been staying away from that for now, and just looking internally. So, but I think the external will support what we've been saying here all along as well. And Eridu, I think, is a argument that Doug Petrovich has been making. I think for the location of Babel, which is really interesting. But so,
Well, what's interesting about
yes,
that is that he attributes the identity of Nimrod to a character that wasn't even on the scene at the right time. Um, have you read his book on Nimrod?
yeah. So, yeah, that's where he differs from those who associate Babel with Nimrod, because I believe his argument is that Nimrod was Sargon of
Yes.
Akkad, which is like 23rd century, something like that, 2200s, which would not be a Babel. That would be like centuries later.
And he is
So,
assuming gaps in the chronology, like we alluded to at the beginning, that your
yeah.
research shows that there are not.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know what his perspective is on the post flood chronology. I'm not exactly sure. So, but those things are worth looking at, and trying to work your way through that external data. needs to be part of a bigger picture of argumentation, I think, and figuring out what's right, what's wrong, and all that. So, but as it relates to our internal evidence, we have all these established political entities. Very difficult to see how that can happen in 352 years. But here's where I think I call those, difficulties, oddities. Here is where I actually think there's an error in the Masoretic text, like an actual error produced by the systematic deflation. And that's the description in Abraham's epitaph that he died in a good old age, an old man full of years at the age of 175. Okay. The problem with this is that in the Masoretic chronology, Eber is still alive and more than double the age of Abraham. So picture this, you're in the modern day and a man dies at the age of 40. Would you call him an old man and full of years? You wouldn't. If a man was 90, you would call him an old man and full of years in today's parlance, right? 90 would be an old man and full of years. That's pretty good. But in the context of Abraham in the Masoretic text, he's not an old man and full of years. He's lived less than half the life of Eber. Shem has only died 25 years or so before Abraham's death, depending on how you reckon that chronology. Noah's death at 950, only 2 years before Abraham is born. And then the fourth is the Genesis 11, like Genesis 5, says that these patriarchs had other sons and daughters. And it's perfectly reasonable to presume that they lived to ages that are similar to the named patriarchs, Arphaxad, Shelah, and Eber. Okay, so, and we know that men lived longer, not just the Messianic line, because Ishmael later lived to be 137. He's not in the Messianic line. So this is not, the long ages are not just limited to people in the Messianic line. In my thinking, the post-flood descendants lived to these ages. So Abraham is swimming in a world in the Masoretic text of people who lived twice as old as him. And this just doesn't jibe at all with the description of his epitaph. He would have died young in the Masoretic text. And so to me, this is explicit evidence of an error that when the text was deflated, the rabbis didn't account for it. They didn't account for this. They accounted for lots of stuff. They didn't touch Noah's numbers. They didn't touch Abraham's numbers. They didn't mess with the flood narrative. They didn't mess with Lamech's numbers either, because he was too close to the flood. Jared's numbers, he was close up to the flood. They didn't mess with his numbers. They didn't want him to live in through the flood. They left a number of these patriarchs alone, but they didn't account for this incongruity in the text. It's only coherent with the longer post-flood chronology that we find deposited in the Septuagint text and in the Samaritan Pentateuch as the supporting witness, plus all the other witnesses I mentioned earlier. So I don't think this can be internally reconciled. Maybe somebody has an argument that would rebut my claim. I haven't read one yet, or I haven't heard one. And if we have a high view of the Bible, that God is speaking and the Bible is internally coherent because it's God's speech and it can't contradict itself, then the Masoretic text is contradictory here. And this points us in the direction of there's something wrong with the chronology in the Masoretic text in Genesis 11. And so I tried to limit my critique internal, because that's the word of God, right? So I just encourage people to just think that through, read the text, read what it says, think about the implications, and consider it. I think it's worthy of consideration, and I think it points in the direction that we've been headed all along. All right, so it took me 1 hour and 40 minutes, Mike, to get to what you introduced us to at the very beginning of our presentation. You have been awesome in allowing me to do this, and I really appreciate it. So let's talk about the rabbis. Let's talk about what I call the rabbinic deflation hypothesis, okay? So My friend Jeremy Sexton wrote an article in the Westminster Journal 10 years ago where he alludes to this as the explanation for the Masoretic's chronology. We wrote an article together in Bible and Spade, which is an ABR publication, popular level one, talking about this. And I talk about it in a number of my papers and a number of videos. Remember, we talked about motive, means, and opportunity. So let's think about the rabbis in the post 70 AD milieu. The first thing we want to talk about is what's the theological context. There is a movement called chronomessianism, and that simply is a fascination with trying to calculate the time and the coming of the Messiah.
Okay, I think we have a lot of chrono-rapturism today.
Chrono-rapturism. We had chrono-messianism back at this period of time, right? It's kind of the idea. The idea was, you have the Genesis 5 and 11 history. You have the prophecies in Daniel 9. You kind of do the figures and the calculations, and you can try to calculate when the Messiah is going to arrive in history. Many of the rabbis reasoned that since God made the world in 6 days, each day represented 1,000 years, and thus the world would last a total of 7,000 years. You talked about this at the very beginning of our show, right? This idea comes from a really bad interpretation of Psalm 90 and the gospel and Peter's epistle. And it's also found in the book of Jubilees, is the first place that I have found this idea of interpreting history in terms of these 1,000-year blocks based on the creation account. Okay, so they reasoned, well, the world consists of these 1,000-year blocks of history based on the creation count. The world was created in 6 days, and so the seventh day would be the 6,000th year would be the inauguration of the Messiah, right? The time of rest. But other, so let me say, some schemes said that the Messiah would arrive in the 6th millennium and usher in the kingdom in the 7th. And there were variations. There were different ideas about how this worked. But this was the general idea. But there were other schemes that had developed for much shorter timelines in and around the year 4000. And the AM means Anno Mundi, from creation. This idea shows up in the Babylonian Talmud, for example, later on. So these were competing ideas in intertestamental Judaism and rabbinic Judaism, because we see in the rabbinic writings in what's called the Seder Olam a new construction of world history, where the time is shrunk considerably to the point where it's less than 4,000 years at that time period. They severely compress the post-exilic period. It's ahistorical. It makes the Persian era 52 years in length, which is utterly impossible. It's just literally impossible. It's ahistorical. It's non-historical. And so they compressed history, and they adopted a non-messianic interpretation of Daniel 9. They tried to correlate it with the destruction of the temple instead of the coming of the Messiah, because my theory is that they were under this threat of the church. The Jesus movement was a threat to them, and then the temple is destroyed, and they're persecuted by the Romans. So there's a lot that's happening here in post-temple Judaism.
So basically, we have evidence that the rabbis did that altering the time, changing the times, were not outside the realm of what they were capable of doing.
That's exactly right. The Seder Olam proves that they were willing to compress history for theological reasons. And the Seder Olam is the official world history of Orthodox Judaism. Even today, there are rabbis that follow that construct, even though we know that the Persian history is completely false. It's completely wrong. So there's a willingness here in this theological milieu to do this to the history. So if you're looking for a situation where, well, why would somebody change the numbers in Genesis 5:11? What's their motive? The motive is chronomessianism. We're going to put Jesus outside the time of the Messiah. Okay, we're going to argue about messianic texts in Daniel and Isaiah and so forth, and we're going to dispute the church and how they interpret it. The Isaiah 7:14, the virgin verse, all of that we're going to dispute with the church. We're going to fight and argue about that. We're going to say the church is wrong and blah blah blah. But another way that we can undermine the claim that Jesus is the Messiah is by changing the timeline of world history and introducing a new timeline that says your Messiah came too soon. He's a fake. And this is another sort of fork in their argument, in their pitchfork, if you want to say it that way, of saying that Jesus is not the Messiah.
Right.
And so it's pretty clear to me that there's a willingness here to make a phony history, because that's what the Seder Olam is.
Right, because I've spent a lot of time in my research on this channel. I have a very extensive and long, well-cited study on my website that I wrote, Daniel 9:25, Prophecy, the Countdown to the Messiah, where we show that it was to the year, that Daniel countdown that you mentioned,
Yes.
from around 444 BC to 33 AD is to the year when Jesus came in at the triumphal entry. That is a 69-week of year countdown. And that's undoubtedly what the early Christians were touting and were saying. And it should have been very compelling to the Jews at the time. And I think it was, which is why a lot of them were converting. And going back to what you said, it creates that environment where it's putting that extreme pressure on the rabbis to have to try to rebut that somehow. How do you rebut it? Well, one way is to alter the chronology to make it say, well, he actually didn't come at the right time.
Yes. Yep. That's right. And we should note here, Mike, maybe a concern that some listeners might have about this coming across as sort of like anti-Semitic or something along those lines. That's an accusation that's out there. This is a spiritual battle that was taking place. This is not ethnic. This is a spiritual battle between the Jesus, the Jewish Messiah, and his people, who are Jews and Gentiles, versus the rabbinic system of theology. And so it's not anti-Semitic in any kind of way. And the way that we understand that term today, we should understand that this is a spiritual and religious conflict that was taking place. Now, that's not to defend whenever the church in history has mistreated Jews or anything like that. It has nothing to do with that. I would never defend those instances historically where that's happened. But we got to be honest about where the evidence points. And if it points to individuals doing this, then that's what the evidence is, and we shouldn't be afraid of it. But
right. People that watch
want
this channel know that this is not
Yes.
an anti-Jewish channel. In fact,
Yes.
most of the time we get accused of the opposite. We
Okay.
support Israel too much to a fault.
Yeah. And I'm mentioning that not to be defensive, but to be transparent, and to be honest. We want to be honest with the evidence about the evidence.
Agreed.
And the spiritual realities of the early rabbis, because we have evidence, from Justin Martyr, that they traveled into the diaspora to tell people that the disciples stole the body from the tomb and made up the resurrection story. So it's not like we don't have proof to show that there was a conflict. I mean, that's clear from the Bible, from the New Testament itself, and from external witnesses that this is what was going on. So there's no question about any of that. So by dating creation to about 3761 BC, that's how it shakes out. The rabbis managed to put Jesus outside the days of the Messiah. Now, let me say this. If you want to argue, if the rabbis want to argue with the church at this time about the interpretation of Isaiah 7:14 or Daniel 9, you don't need to change the text to come up with some exegetical argument to try to get away from the messianic interpretation. But when it comes to Genesis 5 and 11 and the calculation of time, you don't have any other choice. You can't reinterpret the numbers. You got to change them. So some people say, well, why didn't they change Daniel 9? And why didn't they change this? And why didn't they change that? Well, they didn't necessarily have to do that. They could just offer an alternative exegetical argument to reinterpret the text and try to get away from the messianic implications, or at least how it points to Christ, right? But in the case of Genesis 5 and 11, there's no getting away from it. So if you're going to change it, you got to change the manuscripts.
And like you said,
no way around
the chronomessianism at that time would have been so broad, and I've actually looked into the work of Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver, who you had I think one of his works cited there. I cite him also in that
Yes,
Daniel 9:25 study.
very
But
help. He's very helpful on this.
yes,
Point.
and he
Yes.
shows that the anticipation at that time was incredible, and
Yeah.
so that's another evidence why they could not have. They would have been limited in what they could reasonably change, because again, they're living at a time where the chronomessianism, the knowledge of the Daniel 9:24 to 27 prophecy would have been so pervasive that you couldn't just go and change it without uh, outrage or some pushback, I would imagine, from the broader population, who again is very familiar with it.
Yeah, that's good. So again, I'm restating it here on this slide to discredit Jesus. So this is the motivation. It's chronomessianic motivation. The second point, authority. Are the rabbis in a position to control the Hebrew text that survived the destruction of the temple? Because all the other sects of Judaism disappear. They all disappear. So they're the only ones who have what survived in the Hebrew manuscripts. And the only, until we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, the only Hebrew text we had was the Masoretic text. So it went through a funnel of rabbinic control. So where they were faithful in preserving it, we get the benefit. Wherever they may have been not faithful, either by accident or in this case deliberately, we don't have the benefit, right? So they've got control over the manuscripts, and they issue new manuscripts. They make new manuscripts. They get rid of the old ones. They had the authority to do that. Rabbi Akiva, in particular, it's clear from the documentation of his life, he was kind of the man sort of in control. So they had the authority to change the text. So a 19th century scholar, biblical chronologist, and he was an Egyptologist as well, Sepharth, his last name is. He says it this way: in short, after the destruction of Jerusalem, it was possible to introduce a corrupted biblical chronology. His point is what I've been saying. The historical circumstances were perfect. If you wanted to do this and you had to want to have a success of getting away with it, this was the historical circumstances where it could happen. The manuscript tradition was funneled through a small group of leaders. And so, and the opposite with the Septuagint, you have the complete opposite of that. There's no funneling at all. The text is translated and it goes out into the entire diaspora. No one has central authority, has any control over that text. So this is an important part. You can't just say it's an off scribe changing the text. That's not going to work. The other part is, remember, the rabbis carried great authority. And even in the New Testament, we see that rabbis from Jerusalem traveled to other cities to exert their authority. I think Paul mentions this in the book of Acts. I'm not exactly sure where that is. I can't remember. In the diaspora, in the post-temple world, they did the same thing. So the rabbis traveled. This would be how they could introduce the new chronology into the diaspora. Hey, here come the Jerusalem rabbis. They must know. They know. They have the authority. They have the manuscripts from the temple. They're teaching us this is the way that it is. So they have the power. They have the authority to do that in the diaspora in a unique kind of way. So,
It
and
would
we
be
know
like
from
the Vatican sending out emissaries or
yeah,
missionaries of some kind to say, this is the official papal or whatever position, and everyone else has to kind of go along with it, because that
yes,
was the centralized control.
that's right. So again, opportunity. Now, I mentioned earlier also, right, about the Septuagint being inflated. We have no ancient testimonies talking about that. Well, now we have the flip. Do we have anybody in the ancient world saying that the rabbis changed the text. Well, we do. We have Eusebius. Now, Eusebius attributed it to a different motive. It had to do with the age of marrying and having children. But he was convinced that the rabbis changed the text. And in fact, he argues the Septuagint preserves the original numbers, and the numbers came from a Hebrew manuscript that they were translated from. So this wasn't Eusebius believing that the Septuagint was inspired, which a lot of early Christians believed. Eusebius argued that the numbers came from the Hebrew. He just had the motive wrong for the rabbis doing it. We have Julian of Toledo, all the way in Spain, making this argument. Jacob of Edessa is a Syriac scholar in the 7th century, and we're going to talk about him in a moment. And then an Armenian scholar named Bar Hebraeus, a little bit later. Maybe that's not ancient, maybe that's more medieval. But we have a chain of testimony from many centuries ago about this being the reason. Now, let me mention here, I just want to mention this fascinating evidence from Jacob of Edessa. He's a Syriac scholar, so he lives in Syria. The standard Old Testament text in Syria comes from the rabbis in Jerusalem. And so the standard Syriac text in Genesis has the Masoretic numbers. But what's interesting is Jacob rejects those numbers. He rejects them because he says the original text was falsified by the same Hebrews to show that the Christ had not come yet, Messianic chronology. And then he explains it. He goes on, his translation of Genesis, so he did his own Syriac translation. He didn't like the Syriac Peshitta, which is what it was called. He wanted to do his own translation. But Jacob uses the longer chronology and claims that there were certain Hebrew manuscripts at his time that confirmed the Septuagint chronology in the 7th century in Syria. So isn't that fascinating? So here we have a prolific Syriac Christian scholar who rejects the Masoretic numbers, attributes the changes to the rabbis, and claims that there's Hebrew manuscripts with the Septuagint chronology in it. Really powerful witness to the longer chronology and to the rabbinic deflation theory. Really, really important, Jacob of Edessa. A little bit later, I would have preferred if he was like 300 AD, but still, this is a trustworthy scholar that's well known in Syriac studies, not known a lot by us in the West, but really, really important witness. I mentioned earlier there's internal evidence that the rabbis didn't change certain numbers related to the flood narrative, Shem and Terah and Methuselah and Lamech and so on. And as I mentioned, the incongruity with Abraham's epitaph shows that the post-flood chronologies seems to be erroneous. So motive, chronomessianism, means they had control over the manuscript tradition funneled through them at the destruction of the temple. All the other sects of Judaism disappear. Opportunity, historical circumstances, and a theological milieu which could be used to justify the changes. Because that's another part of this. You got to have the guts to change, or the deception, maybe is the better word. Deception, maybe that's a better word. You have to be convinced that the text of the scriptures need to be altered in this systematic way. You've got to have yourself a high level of motivation. It's not just, Egyptian chronology is different than ours, we're going to change the numbers. No. This is a serious crime. And for a serious crime, you got to have a serious motive. And I've said that from the beginning. If you want to argue that the Masoretic is original, go for it, study it, but you got to attribute a really strong motive the other way around. If you want to say that it was inflated, what's the motive? What's the historical circumstances? What's the opportunity? Who did it? The central authority, were they in control of it? All those questions have to be positively answered. So as much as I was loath to accept it, I eventually accepted that this explanation seemed to fit all of the evidence as the best that I understood it. And so when you calculate the timeline of history, going again all the way back to your introduction, Mike, you get about 7,500 years from creation, which has implications for the issue that you addressed in the beginning.
Right, and it has so many applications. We touched on just a couple of them here. This is a primarily Bible prophecy dealing channel, so I wanted to make sure that my audience is aware of that. So that's why I set the table with that. But we touched on some of the other issues. But I do want to just take you back to one thing, just for clarity's sake.
Yes, sir.
So can you go over again why the rabbis did not change the pre-flood chronology? And I think it has something to do with because it gives the begetting age and then the length of life afterwards. Is that correct? And just can you explain that over again?
They changed some of the ages in the pre-flood chronology. They shrunk the pre-flood chronology by 600 years. Okay, but they had to make two changes. They had to change the beginning age, but then they had to change the remaining years because the lifespans are in the original text of Genesis 5. So they had to add up together correctly. In Genesis 11, the lifespans are not there in the original text. And so you see in the Masoretic text, they didn't change the remaining years. They remained intact because they didn't have to change them to make the math add up because there's no lifespans. So it's very interesting. And remember how I said the Masoretic remaining years in Genesis 11 match the Septuagints, okay? In the pre-flood world, they changed 6 of the patriarchs to deflate it 600 years, but they left alone Methuselah, Jared, and Lamech because they're all too close to the flood. And if they started fooling around with those numbers, they'd have people living past the flood, or too many of them clustered closely to the flood. So they left those numbers alone. And that to me is more evidence of deflation. They didn't tinker with those numbers. If you deflate Methuselah's number just a little bit, he lives past the flood. So
that is another thing I wanted to talk about, because
yes.
Isn't that a common criticism of the Septuagint, that that what you just said does happen in the Septuagint? Methuselah seems to live past the flood.
Yes. Yeah, I didn't mention that, and I should have mentioned that. I have a whole video presentation over an hour that I do going through all the manuscript and external witness evidence. There are some manuscripts of the Septuagint that have Methuselah living through the flood, but not all of them. And all of the earliest witnesses outside of the text, so external witnesses, record the correct number, which is 187, and that's the one that's found also in the Masoretic text. The Masoretic is correct for Methuselah. It was not changed by the rabbis. The original Septuagint number matches the Masoretic. And in my work, I go through a long explanation as to why I think the number was changed in some of the manuscripts by accident to 167, and it created a complicated mess historically in the manuscripts. The very first person to record the 167, which is the wrong number, is Theophilus of Antioch in the late 2nd century. So before that, all the external witnesses record 187, or their chronology requires 187 to be the beginning age for Methuselah. So that's a really good question. What's happened historically, Mike, is because some manuscripts put Methuselah past the flood, people have used that to discredit the Septuagint completely.
Yeah.
Now that's a fallacy. That's a fallacious argument. That argument goes all the way back to Jerome, which was surprising to me because Jerome was so brilliant and such an important scholar in the history of the church. I mean, he gave us the Latin Vulgate, which spread the Old Testament throughout the Christian world in a powerful way. But in this case, he made a methodological error, in my judgment. So that's the story with Methuselah. The idea that Methuselah lived past the flood, the idea should metaphorically drown in the flood, as I say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when it comes down to it, you have people who are nitpicking and you can find things wrong in the Septuagint. No one
Correct.
here, I'm sure Henry also would not say the Septuagint is perfect. There are problems with the Septuagint in certain ways or certain
Yes,
manuscripts, certain translations. So we're not saying it's perfect in every way. What I think he's saying is that it does a better job in general of preserving the original numbers. And even in this case, you have the original going way back, but you see how a scribal error worked its way in. That's a very different thing from a systematic conspiracy by a central authority to disseminate knowingly wrong information. That's not even remotely comparable.
that's correct. Well, I should add too, don't take my argument to mean that all of the Septuagint is superior to the Masoretic text either. I'm saying in these instances, it's superior. It reflects the original text, but that doesn't mean the Septuagint of Isaiah is better than the Masoretic or Job or Exodus or something like that. You can't extrapolate it that in that direction. It's on this particular subject. It is the superior original set of readings for the most part, with a couple of exceptions. But you don't extrapolate it the other way either. Each difference has to be handled on its own terms. So just so folks should understand that doesn't mean we should completely throw out the Masoretic text, because a large, vast portion of the Masoretic text preserves the original text of the Old Testament for us, and
Right,
for that we
we're
should be
by
very
no
grateful.
means saying that the Masoretic text, when you look in your Old Testaments today, we're by no means saying that the Old Testament is unreliable or that it's a bad translation. Not at all.
That's
We're
correct.
specifically addressing the issue of the chronology, where we extrapolate to understand the length of time between Adam and the present,
That's
and
exactly right.
certain messianic content, which you alluded to,
Yes,
but is not really part of the presentation.
sure. And one more thing I should say too: there's other chronology in the Old Testament, like the divided kingdom. The Septuagint's chronology for the divided kingdom is a disaster. The Masoretic text meticulously preserves the divided kingdom periods chronology perfectly. I mean, it is pristinely, it's been shown by numerous scholars to be right on the money and in accord with archaeological evidence to the very day in some cases. So again, just even in the subject of chronology, it's different in the book of First and Second Kings versus the book of Genesis. So I should qualify that as well. Again, each individual case has to be weighed on its own merits.
Right, and
So
that's why we have the field of text criticism, where we're trying to determine and uncover what is the original reading. So it's
yeah,
a whole science where that's what Henry is doing in his studies.
yeah.
So, and that's what we want to do. We want to understand what was the original and have evidence for it.
Well, excellent. Well, Mike, I am so grateful that you gave me such a long time and such a great platform to share all this research. I'm really thankful, and I hope it's helpful for people dealing with this issue of trying to calculate the time of the coming of the Messiah based on the 6,000 years and all that kind of stuff. I don't think that's warranted by Scripture. I, in my own view, I think Jesus prohibits us from doing that to begin with, and if the Septuagint preserves the original numbers, it throws the whole baby out with the bathwater anyway.
Right. Well, I want to thank you so much for coming on today. This was super helpful, just fascinating, enlightening. And again, all of Henry's links, guys, are going to be in the description or in the pinned comment. So please check those out. Don't take his word for it. Don't take my word for it. Be a Berean. Look into it
Amen.
yourself, and see what conclusion you come to. So thank you guys again for watching. God bless you, and I will see you on the next video.